Hello everyone and welcome back to the Professional Diploma in Photography. Welcome to Module 1, Lesson number 3. Did you know that there are currently 12 Hasselblad cameras left on the surface of the moon? Unfortunately, they didn't make the return trip home because they had to be left behind to make room for the moon rocks that astronauts brought back to Earth. Of course, the film magazines made the return flight. So maybe one day someone will go up there and will retrieve those Hasselblads. I can guarantee you that they're worth an absolute fortune. So very interesting fact. So you're here with myself, William Eames, your course educator. Great to see you all here for lesson number 3. I do hope that you enjoyed your first 2 lessons in photography and that you've got a better understanding of your camera now, and I hope you got a chance to get out there and start practicing and start using some of those modes that we dug into in lesson number 2. Remember, you are on a 4-module course. Each module has 8 lessons altogether, and we are slowly advancing towards getting your professional certificate, your professional diploma in photography. And you'll hear me say it often throughout this course, the key to success on these lessons is to attend all of them. You will learn something valuable in every single lesson that you can apply to your photography. Remember, of course, if you have any questions at all, to chat with Morpheus. Just pop in your questions there, have a chat with him, and do remember to rate those responses too, so that we can continually improve them. And let me just ask you a very quick question. So what mode have you found to be most useful so far? So we had a look at a lot of different modes there in lesson number 2. We had a look at our shutter priority, our aperture priority. We had a look at our automatic, our program mode. We had a look at some of those other modes like our macro modes and our sports modes. Which one have you been using, and which one would you like to get to know to use as well? Which I think for most of us it is that fully manual one. Now, if you're already photographing in fully manual, well done to you. There's still plenty, of course, to learn throughout the rest of these lessons. Now, if by any chance you did miss any lessons, lesson 1 or lesson 2, it is possible to catch up, of course, through our recordings available on shawacademy.com and indeed through the app as well. You can also reschedule your classes too to choose a time that better suits you. So if you're finding that you're struggling to attend the lessons at the time you chose, you can, of course, reschedule to suit your own lifestyle. So let's move on and get into lesson number 3. We're going to talk all about our camera's lenses and demystify all of these numbers that appear on the lenses, explain exactly what they mean. Now, I briefly mentioned in the previous lesson about sensor sizes, and there's lots of different sensor sizes depending on the type of camera that we're using. Hopefully you're more familiar with the type of camera that you're using now after lesson 1 and 2. You may have done a little bit of investigation around it and indeed around its sensor size. But for the purpose of this lesson, just to make things kind of straightforward and easy to follow, we're going to be going based on a full frame sensor. So this is kind of the standard. It's been the standard, throughout pretty much the 20th century, and full frame sensors are 35 millimeters. So all the focal lengths that I speak about, all the lens measurements are going to be based on this sensor size. They're going to vary slightly. If you're using, say, an APS-C size sensor, you might find that there's slightly different focal lengths there, but the basic principles are going to remain the same, as you're going to see throughout this lesson. But just in case you are wondering and you are at a little bit more of an advanced level, we're going to be taking things as though we are talking about a 35mm full frame camera. So let's have a look at our lens components. Let's break them down just the same way we did exactly with our cameras in lesson number 2. And the first thing to establish is that there's 2 types of lens constructions available to us. There are zoom lenses and there are also fixed lenses as well. But any lens that has a variable or changeable focal length is considered a zoom lens. A zoom lens simply refers to a lens's ability to be able to zoom in and out. It does not necessarily mean it's used just for far away objects. So very often when I speak about telephoto lenses, students will refer to them as zoom lenses, and that's not actually correct. A zoom lens can be any type of lens that has a variable focal length. So for example, you can have a wide angle zoom lens. So that means you can still zoom in and out, but it remains a wide angle lens. And basically, the way to know if you've got a zoom lens or not is if it simply zooms in and out, if you have the ability to change the focal length. Like on this Canon here, you can see it says 18 to 35 millimeters. That means it starts at an 18 millimeter range, very, very wide, and it goes up to 105 or 135 millimeters in this case. So that's quite a broad range there that you have in that lens. Most kit lenses, most lenses that are included with your cameras are some type of zoom lens. Then we also have our fixed lenses. These are also known as prime lenses, and basically this is anything that has a fixed focal length. Okay, now I'll explain what focal length is now in just a moment, but basically this means you cannot zoom in or out with it. What you see is what you get. So for example, with the Sigma 50mm lens here on screen, it only stays at 50 millimeters. If I want to get closer to a subject, I have to physically get closer to them. I need to walk closer to them and to enlarge them in the scene. If I want to go wider, I need to take a step back to go wide, to let more in the scene. So these are fixed focal lengths. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages to both these types of lenses. Obviously, with a zoom lens, the advantage is that they're convenient because they cover a broader range. You don't have to be changing your lens as frequently. Fixed lenses or prime lenses usually are higher quality though. They tend to be sharper, and they also have wider aperture ranges, which we will speak about later on. But that doesn't mean that you need to rush out and start buying loads of prime lenses. Zoom lenses are also very good and can also be of very, very high quality. And you'll understand your lenses a lot more by the end of this lesson. Let's have a look at lens components. So here we've just got a Canon lens for the purpose of this demonstration. And this is a zoom lens. It's a 24 to 70 millimeter zoom lens. But let's break down, as you can see, there's a lot of numbers on this. There's a lot of information on it. So let's have a look at exactly, what's going on. So first of all, we have our current focal length. So what we can see here is that when we are zooming in and out, we can actually see roughly what focal length we're currently using for the shot. So in this case, it's set at 24 millimeters, but I could zoom in and I could zoom in all the way up to 70 millimeters, getting closer to the subject as I zoom in. We have our zoom ring located just above that conveniently, so it might vary slightly depending on the brand of lens you're using. Sometimes the zoom rings are at the front of the lens, usually they're at the back. We have a distance scale. Now, not all lenses will have this. So the majority of lenses actually don't include a distance scale anymore. But this is used for focusing when we are not able to actually look through the camera. So we would use this in very particular situations for landscape photography, for night sky photography, where it's difficult to see through the camera in some instances, and we can actually set the focus by using the distance scale. They've removed it from a lot of lenses now because autofocus systems are generally so advanced. It's become somewhat redundant, but you will still find it on higher quality lenses. Beside that, we have our AF/MF switch. So like we had a look at in the previous lesson, switching from autofocus to manual focus. We have our focusing ring. So when we are in manual focus, we can focus the lens using the manual focusing ring there. We have our lens cap, pretty straightforward. Just underneath that, we have our lens aperture and info. So we can see here again, it's saying Canon lens EF 24 to 70 millimeter, 1 to 4 LIS USM. So what does all of that mean? Well, we'll break them down, but basically that means it's an electronic focus. EF is electronic focus, 24 to 70 millimeter lens. Its aperture starts at f4, the L stands for luxury, IS is image stabilizer, and USM is ultrasonic motor. So a lot there in that information, but we will break all of that down now in just a moment. There we have some more lens information there. As you can see, 24 to 70mm image stabilizer, ultrasonic, and we have our rear lens cap. And of course, you should always have the rear lens cap on if you don't have the lens attached to your camera. You don't want it to damage the back part of the lens, or any part of the lens for that matter. But the communication with the camera happens in the rear, so you need to make sure that you do keep the rear lens cap on if you ever take your lens off your camera. Looking at the front of the lens, we have our front lens element. Okay, so the elements are basically referring to the glass inside the lens. There's a lot of elements on the inside of the lens as well, and there's an element at the rear of the lens too. So if you ever hear someone talk about that, basically what they're speaking about is simply the glass that's in the lens or on the front of the lens. Here we have a bayonet for a lens hood, so we can attach lens hoods to our lenses. We'll speak about them in a second, but we can find that just located around the edge of the front of the lens. Here we've got our focal length and aperture info again, and here we've got a thread for our filters. So just on the inside of the front of the lens, you're going to notice that there is a thread. This is for attaching filters, which we're going to speak about, you guessed it, in a later lesson. But we can attach filters to the front of the lens using this thread, and you can find the thread size there just beside it. So that little indication that 77mm. Now, don't get that confused with your focal length, but this refers to the diameter of the front of the lens. This is so that you get the right lens caps if you ever lose your lens cap, and you get the right sized filters as well. A few other things to be aware of with our lens as well. I've mentioned it a lot now at this stage, but what is focal length? So basically, focal length refers to how much the lens can see. Now, to get a little bit technical here, it is the distance where the photo becomes focused in the lens, measured from the camera's imaging sensor, or of course your film. We'll have a look at that now in a second. We'll actually just visualize it to show you what I mean by that. But to simplify it, the lower the number, the millimeters, the wider the lens and the photo is going to be. Okay, so if there's anything that you take away from this particular lesson, it's that. To simplify this, the lower the number of the millimeters, the wider the lens and the photograph are going to be. And obviously then the opposite, the higher the number, the closer the lens and the photograph. So for example, a 20mm lens, that's considered a wide lens. A 200mm lens is a telephoto or a zoomed in lens. Okay, so don't get that confused with the zoom lenses. It is a telephoto lens. And as you can see, the difference between 20 and 200 is 10 times. So our 200mm lens is 10 times more zoomed in compared to our wide lens. Let's visualize that as I said. So if we have a look, there's a point in the lens where the image comes into focus. So when we're focusing, there's a point in the lens where the image comes into focus. This point is measured from the image sensor or film. And sensor size now is also a factor. Again, that's just if you're a little bit more advanced, but we won't concern ourselves too much with that now. But if we actually visualize this, so say I'm using a 50mm lens, one of my favorite lenses, not that particular one, but that focal length is just a really, really good focal length. But if I'm using a 50mm lens and I'm focusing it, that point where the image comes into focus in the lens is measured against the distance from the image sensor, and that's where we get our focal length. Okay, so in this case, that point where it's in focus is 50mm away from the image sensor. Now, that's where the millimeters comes from. A wide lens will have a point of focus that's much closer to the camera sensor. A telephoto lens will have it much further away, and that's why these lenses are so much bigger. So if you ever think, like if you've ever seen a 300mm lens, you'll know that it's much, much bigger compared to, say, a wide angle lens. And the reason for this is because the actual point where the image comes into focus is much further away compared to our wide angle lens. Now, In a zoom lens, this point of focus moves as you zoom in and as you zoom out. So like our 24 to 70mm lens that we had a look at there earlier on, when I'm zooming in and I'm zooming out, that's why when I zoom in, the lens extends, because that point of focus is moving further away from the image sensor and vice versa. Now, don't worry if that's still quite complicated. The takeaway from that, as I said, is that the lower the millimeters, the wider your lens is going to be. Now, talking about image stabilizers, so another thing we saw on the lenses was our IS. Now, image stabilizers basically help to reduce camera shake. Now, they might be called something slightly different depending on your camera. So on Nikon's, they're called VR, vibration reduction. On Sigma lenses, they're called OS, optical stabilization, and so on. It's going to change depending on the lens. But they're very useful to have switched on. They help to reduce camera shake when you're using particularly longer lenses like a telephoto lens. They're very, very useful. It is recommended though that you switch them off if you are putting your camera onto a tripod, because they can actually cause a little bit of camera shake when your camera's on a tripod. Now, there is also in lens and in body stabilization. So some cameras will have the lenses actually in the lens themselves. So, for example, our Canons, our Nikons, our Tamrons, our Sigmas, and so on. But some cameras will actually have it located in the body. So Sony's, Pentax's, I believe, and Olympus cameras and so on, they all have the image stabilizer actually located in the camera itself. Now, there's a big advantage to that, which means that any camera or any lens you attach to the camera will have the option of image stabilization, as opposed to it being in the lens. So a lot of cameras now are kind of moving towards having an in-body instead. You'll often hear them called 5-axis stabilization, which means you've got up to 5 stops of stabilization. Very, very useful. But do check your camera's manual as per usual to find out which option is available to you. Breaking down our lenses even more, another thing we spoke about and we're going to be speaking an awful lot about are apertures. So we saw this. Now this is a slightly different one. This is 1 to 1.4, and this basically means that our aperture is starting from 1.4. Lenses will display the widest aperture available to you. It starts from the widest aperture available to you. Not all lenses will have the same widest aperture values. Lenses with very wide apertures are known as fast lenses because they let in so much light. So if you've ever heard a photographer saying that's a very fast lens, what they mean is that there's a lot of light can come into that lens because it can have a very wide aperture. On zoom lenses, aperture values can be a little bit more complicated. So if you're using an 18 to 55mm lens, you're going to be very familiar with these numbers on the front. We have our 1, but we've got 3.5 to 5.6. So basically, with zoom lenses, we all have what are called variable apertures. This means that when you zoom in, the aperture will close down or become smaller automatically, and this is just simply due to their construction. So if we have a look at these numbers, our 3.5 to 5.6, basically what that means is that it corresponds to the respective focal length. So again, we're going by our widest aperture and it corresponds to the respective focal length. So in other words, at 18mm, the widest aperture available to us is f3.5. At 55mm, the widest aperture available to us is f5.6. So when I zoom in from 18 to 55mm, my aperture will automatically close down if I have it set to its widest setting. And it's just simply due to the nature of the construction of these lenses. Now, that doesn't mean that all zoom lenses do this. Like, you can buy zoom lenses that are can have, say, a wide aperture no matter what focal length you're using, but you'll definitely know them because they're really expensive. These are very, very expensive lenses. Fast zoom lenses are among the priciest zoom lenses, or the priciest lenses in general that are out there. So that's all fairly technical stuff. Now, don't panic if you don't fully understand all of this right now. We will be continuing to build upon your knowledge here, but it is just something to be aware of at this stage. Like every time I do this lesson, I always get lots and lots of questions about what all these numbers mean. And it is important to explain them, but you may not fully understand everything yet until we continue to build upon it. And indeed, something like apertures, they're so kind of complex in themselves that there is an entire lesson about them, and that is kind of coming up towards the end of this module, which will be lesson number 6. But moving away from that for the moment, just want to quickly speak about our lens. So it's thankfully something much easier to understand. And basically, a lens hood is simply a shade for your lens, okay? It's designed to block the sun and other light sources to prevent glare and lens flare happening when you're photographing. Now, they're not universal, so most lenses will usually include one with them. Some camera companies aren't so generous though, and you do have to buy them separately. But you can't just buy a universal lens hood, a plastic one anyway. You will generally have to buy one that's specifically designed for your lens. It is possible to buy rubber lens hoods. They are universal, but they're not as effective really. So, when you're buying one of these, you'll definitely have to find the right one that goes with your particular lens. But they are very useful. You'll be surprised at how much they actually cut down glare and lens flare when you are using them. But they can be a little bit chunky, especially if you're using a larger lens. Now, moving away from that, we need to actually start having a look through our lenses and seeing what they see. So we have to speak about their angle of view. Now, I have a question for you. So, what do you think is the angle of human vision? So I want you to do something here very quickly for me. I want you to look straight forward, and I want you to try and guess what the angle of human vision is. So I'm talking about degrees. Okay, so when I talk about angles, do you think it's 90 degrees? Do you think it's 360 degrees? What do you think it is? Now, think about it, have a look straight forward, and try to take into account your periphery vision as well. Okay, so the angle of human vision is approximately 130 degrees. 130 degrees. So that is actually very wide. Now, that might be quite surprising, but as I mentioned, it does take into account the peripheral vision as well. Now, what's actually in focus is much smaller than that. So when we look forward again, think about just pick a point, something to look at, and have a look at it, and you'll see that it comes into focus. But everything else beside, in your peripheral vision is still out of focus. We're aware of it, we know that it's there, but the focus angle of human vision is about 50 degrees. And this very much closely matches our 50mm lens, and this is why I really like using 50mm lenses, because it matches very closely to our focused field of vision. So if you can learn to use a 50mm lens, in my opinion, you can use any other lens, because it's the standard. It's exactly what we see with our focused field of vision. So if we were to compare our full range of vision, our 130 degrees approximately, to our different lenses, you can see here that a lot of lenses are much wider than our focused field of vision. So if we have a look at our fisheye lenses, for example, that takes into 180 degrees view. Our 14mm still very wide. Now I'm talking about focused field of vision here, not our full vision. But at 114 degrees, that's very wide, and so on. But as you can see, when we continue up and we go to much higher focal lengths, that field of vision becomes very narrow, very narrow indeed. So using a 600mm lens means we have a very narrow field of view. It makes them tricky to use. It's great for long distance subjects such as birds, like it says there, but it does actually make them quite hard to actually point and aim to where you're looking at, because the field of vision is so narrow. But this is actually a really good representation of the kind of different focal lengths and what you might use them for. But let's have a look at this. Let's visualize this, and let's say we are standing on a beach. Perhaps we're lucky enough to be standing here on this rocky shoreline. It's kind of pleasant enough here, and this is exactly what we are seeing. So we have no camera in our hands right now, we're just having a look at the scene and we're taking it all in, and we have this full range of vision. Now this is also including our peripheral vision, so this is the entire scene including our peripheral vision. We decide we want to take a photograph of it, so we attach a lens. In this case we're going to use a 14mm lens. Like I said, it's about 114 degrees approximately. Now my apologies about the resolution of the images there, it is a little bit low, but you still get a sense of this scene. It's still very, very wide, not as wide as our full peripheral vision, but we could change our lens again and we can get a little bit closer. We use a 24mm lens in this case, and that's about 84 degrees approximately, and we still have quite a wide shot. We continue to change our lenses and we use a 50mm lens, and this is much closer to our focused field of vision. So this is not including the periphery vision, but a 50mm lens. If we were actually standing on this beach and we were looking straight forward without taking into account our peripheral vision, we're going to actually see the scene somewhat like this. And it's actually about 46 degrees approximately is what a 50mm lens sees. We want to get even closer to this lighthouse, so we go with a 100mm lens. And a 100mm lens is double a 50mm lens. So we're increasing that focal length from a 50mm lens by 2. So we're doubling in this particular case, and it's about 24 degrees approximately with our 100mm lens. And then we have what's called a super telephoto lens, and we're at 400mm now. In this case, a super telephoto lens, and you can see here that we're only focused on the lighthouse, that we've no sense that we are even standing on a beach at all. And the purpose of this is just to show you how changing your focal length can really change how we interpret the scene and how we see the scene. So let's just compare these 5 photographs together. So if we have a look at our 14mm all the way up to our 400mm, you can see that the scene changes pretty dramatically as we change our lenses. So you could be standing with another 5 different photographers, but you're all using a different lens. You're all going to come out with very different results, just purely based on the focal length. So now we understand focal length and we understand a little bit more about what's actually going on with our lenses. Well, what lenses should we be using? So we'll use this last part of the lesson to have a look at the various lens types that are available to us, the families of lenses that are available to us, starting with our smartphones. So with our smartphones, of course, we can't neglect them, and we do have to have a look at their own lenses as well. And basically, most smartphones or camera phones will have a wide angle lens. Some will actually have 2 lenses, like in this particular image, and that's because they're actually trying to recreate this type of depth of field effect. But in general, our iPhones, our Samsungs, whichever, they all use a wide angle lens. They have a fixed aperture. That means you cannot change the aperture with these cameras. Like smartphones will give us some control nowadays in terms of we can control things like the shutter speed and the ISO, but we cannot control aperture as of yet. The mechanisms for controlling aperture are just too complicated. They're too big to be able to try and fit in a phone. They're great for landscapes, they're great for portraits, they're great for everyday photography. They're really good for macro and food because we can just get in close by physically moving the camera in a little bit closer. But they're not great for wildlife or sports photography because they're very, very wide. Don't really have much creative control with them because we cannot control the depth of field as such. We cannot control the aperture, and they're not really great for low light photographs without a flash in most cases. But of course there are attachments available for them as well. We can actually add lenses to our smartphones as well. So there's loads and loads of different ones out there. You'll often see these kind of packages available, but they range from less than €10 to up to about €100 depending on the quality of the ones you're going for. A couple of recommended brands there, but there's loads, there's hundreds of different brands of them out there. And you should be able to pick them up online. Local camera shops, Amazon, eBay, the usual places to buy these types of lenses. But really, they're adapters for your current lens that will adapt them into either, macro or into wide, and so on. Moving away from our phones then, let's have a look at our general purpose lenses. So our general purpose lenses, we're talking about something in and around our 50mm types lenses. These are designed for all round use. They range from about 24mm up to about 105mm. That's a pretty good standard. They're good all-rounders for landscapes, for people, for street, for studio photography. They can be decent for wildlife and sports photography as well, but they do get a little bit limited, when you're trying to get very, very close to something. Aperture ranges will, of course, vary depending on the type of one you go for. They're a good lens type to start with, and they're generally included as a kit lens in most cameras. So rather than going out there and buying a telephoto lens as your very first lens, you should probably be looking at a general purpose lens instead, to get used to your camera and to get used to using lenses. And these are also available as fixed or zoom versions. And that goes for every other lens that I speak about coming up. You can either buy them as a fixed focal length or as a zoom version. Next, we have our telephoto lenses. A telephoto lens. And basically, this is a lens that has a higher focal length. You probably recognize this type of lens. This one, our standard telephoto lenses are generally in and around a 70 to 300mm range. They have a narrow field of view, as we have seen. The more we zoom in, the narrower our field of view. They're used for wildlife, sports, but they can also be great for street photography and for portrait photography as well. They are typically a much higher price than our standard lenses due to the nature of their constructions, and fast versions, wide aperture versions of these lenses come at a very high cost. They are very, very expensive. They can also be quite tricky to use because I said they have that narrower field of views, and they could just simply be quite heavy, and they are more prone to camera shake. So when we use higher focal lengths, we are going to have to be more aware of camera shake. Going beyond our 300mm range, and then we are into what are known as super telephoto lenses. And these are lenses that are generally massive in physical size, but anything above 300mm range would be considered a super telephoto lens. They are very expensive. You're going to be spending about €1,000 for an entry version of this type of lens. They're also very large, just physically very large and very, very heavy, and they're primarily for wildlife and sports photography. And due to their size, they can require a monopod or a tripod for extra support. So you'll often see, the best example of this actually is if you ever look at sports photography, if you're ever watching the Premiership or whatever sports that you happen to be into, you'll always see the photographers around the side, and you'll see that they're often using these giant lenses, and they often have a monopod attached to them so that they can move very, very quickly and track the footballers or the athletes and so on. But there is a rule of thumb with these types of lenses, and this is a rule of thumb for actually every lens, but it's particularly useful for when we're using telephoto or super telephoto lenses, and that is that your shutter speed should match the focal length of the lens to avoid camera shake. So if you're using a 200mm lens, you should try to set your shutter speed to about a 200th of a second, or as close as possible, to avoid any camera shake. So if you think about this, if you're using, say, a 600mm lens, you have to set your shutter speed to a very, very fast shutter speed to avoid camera shake. So for this reason, our image stabilizers, our tripods are going to be very, very useful, and of course ISO as well, something we'll speak about in our fully manual lesson. But as you can see here, we've got a photographer here, and she has her lens attached to a tripod for a little bit of extra support. And you can see the size of it. It's an absolute giant lens. So these can be very, very large. Now moving to the other end of the scale, of course, we have our wide angle lenses. And wide angle lenses, let's have a look at a 24mm to begin with. Obviously, these are mainly used for capturing landscapes and, of course, for architectural photography as well. And generally, wide angle is anything less and including a 24mm. So anything less than that is considered a wide angle. It takes into more into view than our focus field of vision. So when you're using wide angle lenses, it's really important to actually check the edges of the frame as well, because we're very used to just because of our focus field of vision, just looking, in the center, looking straight forward. So be sure to run your eyes over the edges of the frame. This will become habitual, the more that you do it. But particularly when you're using wide angle lenses, because, and I tell you from experience, the last thing you want is to be photographing, working away. You put your photographs onto the computer later on, and then you find something in the edge of the frame that you didn't see at the time. So do be aware of that when using wide angle lenses. Some distortion can appear at the edges. So because we're using wide angle lenses, they're actually kind of curved. The elements, the glass within wide angle lenses is very, very curved, and this causes distortion of the light, particularly at the edges. And this is very, very apparent and very visual, particularly with extreme wide angle lenses, which we'll speak about in a second. They're used for landscape, architecture, street photography. It can be used for portraits as well, but you do need to be careful, because you have to take into account that distortion. Using a wide angle lens for a close-up portrait, you're going to get a very egg-shaped type of face. You're going to give whoever you're photographing a very big nose, so you do need to be careful of that. But you can use them for portraits. You just need to take a couple of steps back and kind of center your subject to reduce that distortion. They're also absolutely fantastic for night sky photography. So when we speak about night sky photography, I'm talking about photographing, the entire night sky, not photographing, planets, not trying to find particular constellations or anything like that. But those types of photographs where you've got, the Milky Way in the shot, you get these, all of the stars in the photograph. Wide angle lenses are great for that as well. Extreme wide angle lenses, so we can go even wider, and these are mainly used for architectural and indoor photography, not exclusively though, of course. But if you are thinking about doing any kind of architectural photography, perhaps you're a realtor as well, realtors do a lot of photography too, you may look at going for a super wide angle lens. They're usually about 10 to 15mm range, and these are very distinct lenses because they usually have a very, very curved lens, like you can see here on this Nikon 14mm. Very wide angle of view, but they are also quite expensive as well, these types of lenses. And indeed, any of these kind of like super wide lenses or super telephoto lenses and so on, these are considered specialist lenses. So unfortunately, that means they're a higher price. Landscapes primarily, but as I said as well, of course, you can be using them for indoor and interior or architectural photography, or any type of architectural photography. Very distorted at the edges, will need post-production, will need correcting. A lot of cameras will do some kind of in-camera correcting as well with these types of lenses. It does depend on the camera that you're using, but you will need to do some corrections afterwards. This is an example of a fisheye photograph, and as you can see here, extremely distorted at the edges. You can see that we've got this kind of bubble effect almost at the edges, very, very circular, and that's because fisheye lenses, very distinct shape to their lens. These are extremely wide. They're 8 to 15mm range. They have what's called a hemispherical view. So some fisheye lenses can actually see 180 degrees. Those curved elements create a very distinct look, not just to the lens, but to the photographs themselves. They are a very fun lens to use, of course. They're a lot of fun. I've used one myself, had a lens of one for a while. They are very expensive though, and I didn't invest in one in particular because they're very limited use. They're great for extreme sports. Like we've kind of talked about GoPros and that look being synonymous with kind of extreme sports. They're used for creative photography like music videos, or photographing musicians, used a lot in skateboarding and things like that. So they're kind of a very fun kind of creative lens, but I think, for very serious work, they're just a bit too limited. So if you have an extra bit of cash, they're good. They're a good one to buy. But there's a lot of other lenses that you should prioritize before this, and they are actually also really good for night sky photography. Again, similar to our wide lenses, just because they take in so much. And then finally, the last type of lens we'll speak about in this lesson are macro lenses. So macro lenses and macro photography in general is a very specialist area. It's a hugely popular area. Students love doing it. I like doing it myself, although I'm not particularly good at it compared to some photographers that I've seen. Now, macro lenses are available at various focal lengths, so there's no one fixed focal length for a macro lens. And where macro lens differ is that, well, first of all, they're usually a fixed lens. Dedicated macro lenses are usually a fixed focal length. It is possible to get zoom lenses that have a macro function on them, but they're not the same as a dedicated macro lens, and they're a specialized design. So with macro photography, we need to get obviously very, very close to our subjects, and our normal lenses are limited by what's called minimal focusing distance. Basically, there's a point where we're going to get too close where the lens simply cannot focus. It can't find the focus because we're too close. Macro lenses are specially designed to allow to go beyond that minimal focusing distance to enlarge our subject, to make the small large. And because of this, they're more expensive than regular lenses. They are actually great for portraits too. Like, a lot of photographers will actually use macro for portraits because they get this interesting type of depth of field effect, which is very, very nice for portraiture. And as I said, it is a really complex technical area. There's a full lesson all about macro in Module 2 because there's a lot to consider with it. It's quite technical, but there's loads of accessories as well. So, macro lenses are expensive, but there's lots of macro accessories that you can get that can turn regular lenses into macro lenses, which are quite effective too. But that's just a little bit too advanced for this stage, so it's definitely something that we will be coming back to in Module 2. So, that is the end of this lesson all about lenses and the end of lesson number 3. And I do hope I didn't overload you with information. Quite a bit to cover in that lesson. And lenses can be a little bit tricky, but we've got plenty of time to get to practice with them and to put all of this information to use. Let's have a look at what's coming up in the next lesson. So we're going to be talking about composition in the next lesson. So we're moving away from kind of technical aspects, from camera settings and things like that, and we're going to learn how to see. We're going to learn how to see and think like a photographer. So we'll talk about composition. We're going to have a look at aspect ratio as well. One of my pet peeves is, when you take a great photograph and then you just crop it, and you absolutely mess up the photograph through cropping. So we're going to talk about how to crop correctly by selecting the right aspect ratio for your photographs. And we'll have a look at white balance then as well. So, a compositional element is color. And we're going to talk about how we can use white balance to correct color issues. Any issues we might have had, we can correct them using white balance. We can also use it creatively as well to add mood, to add warmth, to add coldness to our photographs too. Now, so your challenge for this lesson, I'd like you to just simply post up a photograph, but tell us what focal length was used for that shot. So, if you used a 50mm lens, let us know. Post up a photograph with that. If you use a telephoto lens, if you use a wide angle lens, and if possible, try to give us the exact focal length that was used. It's going to be a lot easier if you're using fixed lenses, maybe a little bit more difficult if you're using a zoom lens. Post those up to facebook.com/Shaw Academy. So, well done on completing lesson number 3. We're absolutely flying now. Lesson number 4 coming up very, very soon. So thank you so much for joining me for this. I'll talk to you all again very soon. Until then, take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.